Political power of eschatological thinking. This is why Peter Thiel is talking about the Antichrist. My friend Gil Duran writes, just when you thought it couldn't get any weirder, Peter Thiel has announced plans to deliver a 4-part lecture series on the Antichrist. These unusual events will take place at the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco on 4 days in September and October. Duran just released the first of 3 videos on the topic, which you can view here. So, here are my initial thoughts on Thiel's foray into end times theology. Parts 1 and 2 lay the foundations, and parts 3 and 4 offer some answers. 1. An intoxicating seduction. Eschatological thinking has a seductive, intoxicating, spellbinding appeal. Eschatology literally means the study of last things, but can also refer to the end of the world more generally. Here's one way to understand the appeal. Begin with a pessimistic outlook according to which the world is a pretty horrible place overall. This outlook underlies many religious systems, including some versions of Christianity, and one finds it embedded in many utopian ideologies as well. It goes something like this. Our fellow human beings are, in general, quite selfish, callous, narcissistic, cruel, and power-hungry. Most are indifferent to the pain and misfortunes of others. As the German pessimist Arthur Schopenhauer put it, quote, "For the world is hell, and men are on the one hand the tormented souls, and on the other the devils in it." Zooming out, much of civilization's 6,000-year history is little more than a long list of catastrophic wars, exterminations, genocides, and terror. People have been tortured in oubliettes, executed for their political beliefs, and imprisoned indefinitely without charges. Some fates are worse than death. Many parents have watched their children die, and children have witnessed their parents slaughtered. Untold numbers have endured slavery, homelessness, and loneliness, while hundreds of millions struggle with chronic pain, depression, anxiety, and insomnia. About 1.5 times more people perish from suicide each year than homicides, and 500,000 die of homicides annually, a staggering number that transcends our abilities of comprehension. There is, furthermore, no justice in this world. Good people finish last, while evildoers are rewarded for their bad behavior. Hitler may have died by his own hand, but he was never punished for orchestrating the industrial mass murder of 6 million Jews. In contrast, a dear friend of mine, roughly my age, died last August from a rare form of cancer, a terrible fate that she, obviously, did nothing to deserve. The world is a patently unfair, unjust, and unhappy place, all things considered. But what if I were to tell you that everything will be made right in the end? What if all the agony and anguish, suffering and sorrow, terrors and torments will have been worth it? What lies ahead is a refuge of endless ecstasy, where death has been eternally vanquished and the evildoers banished to the torture chambers of perdition. A place where you reunite with your loved ones, surrounded by verdant meadows, sacred streams, and everlasting abundance. Your task right now, while on this earth, is to push through the interminable miseries, because this earthly curse, the dull ache of existence, is but a temporary test implemented by the Almighty in His infinite wisdom to ensure that only the righteous pass through the gates of heaven. This is the seductive power of eschatology. Indeed, some theologians characterize eschatology as providing, quote, the ultimate theodicy, where theodicy refers to an account of why God allows suffering and evil in the world. The grand promise of eschatology is that with the closing of this chapter of worldly history, the scales of cosmic justice will finally be balanced. Good folks will receive the ultimate reward, while those who trafficked in evil will receive the unrelenting punishments they deserve. There may be no justice in this life, but there will be in the afterlife, and that's what, quote-unquote, excuses the presence of suffering and evil right now. The psychological benefit of this mode of thinking is an extraordinary kind of eschatological hope. Such hope is profoundly comforting and offers a deep sense of meaning and purpose in a weary world marked by gratuitous hardships. It provides a potent antidote to the endless awfulness of post-lapsarian life. 2. Eschatological thinking throughout history. Eschatological thinking takes many forms: millennialism, millenarianism, utopianism, and apocalypticism, to name a few. Within the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, end times narratives are linear rather than cyclical, as with many Eastern religions, culminating in the establishment of paradise or utopia. However, the only road to utopia takes humanity through the apocalypse, a term I'm using here in the colloquial sense to mean the complete destruction of the world. To establish heaven on earth, the current world order must be violently torn down and permanently eradicated. Hence, in the religious context, apocalyptic anxieties are often inextricably bound up with utopian expectations. To realize the latter utopian expectations, we must first endure the former, namely the apocalypse. Apocalypticism, then, is the belief that the world's end is imminent. One version of apocalypticism, which I refer to as active eschatology below, claims that one is divinely mandated to actively bring about the end in accordance with God's grand plan for the universe. In other words, one plays a special role in catalyzing the apocalypse. Since what lies on the other side of the apocalypse is paradise, the sooner the apocalypse happens, the sooner utopia will arrive. The power of this thinking is evident in many of the most significant events of human history, including world-altering wars, conflicts, movements, and acts of terrorism. Given the seduction of eschatological promises of a better world to come, a true dedication to and belief in eschatological narratives can mobilize people like no other ideology or worldview can, while simultaneously, quote-unquote, justifying virtually any act to protect, preserve, and accelerate the arrival of paradise, including extreme measures, violence, and even genocide. Almost 10 years ago, I published an article that delineates a thesis I call the clash of eschatologies. This contends that a useful way of understanding the course of history is in terms of conflicting eschatological visions of the future. I adduced a number of historical examples to substantiate this claim. To understand why Peter Thiel in particular is obsessing over the Antichrist and Armageddon, it's worth reproducing a short excerpt of this article. This excerpt covers only a small fraction of the examples presented, but I hope it gives you a sense of the surprising ubiquity of eschatological thinking across cultural space and time. Throughout human history, a staggering number of social, political, and religious movements have been motivated by ideologies of applied eschatology. Once again, the idea that one plays an active role in bringing about the end times. For example, most New Testament scholars in the US and Europe today believe that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who expected the world to end in his lifetime. For example, see Matthew 24:34. When this failed to occur, he voluntarily sacrificed him, quote, to force the hand of God, as Scott McKnight puts it. Following Jesus, a long list of Christian leaders have found themselves under the spell of apocalyptic thinking, including the Apostle Paul, Martin of Tours, Pope Sylvester II, Martin Luther, Christopher Columbus, Hal Lindsey, Pat Robertson, Harold Camping, and the Christian Zionist John Hagee. Furthermore, many significant events in Christian history have been driven by applied eschatological convictions, such as the First Crusade, during which 100,000 Christian fighters believed they were hastening the end of days. The situation is similar within the Islamic tradition. As Ellen Fromhurst writes, some scholars have suggested that Islam was, from the very first revelations of Muhammad, almost entirely an apocalyptic movement. Some have even supposed that Muhammad deliberately failed to designate a successor because he predicted that the final judgment would occur after his death. After Muhammad's death in 632 CE, many bloody battles were waged in the name of the Mahdi, a messianic figure prophesied by hadith, traditional sayings and deeds of Muhammad apart from the Quran, to usher in the final events before the last hour. The very first Mahdi was identified as Muhammad's grandson, but he was certainly not the last. Indeed, Islamic history is cluttered with Mahdi claimants, including one who, along with several hundred insurgents, seized Mecca's Grand Mosque for 2 weeks in 1979, with some 100,000 hostages trapped inside. As of 2013, approximately 3,000 Mahdi claimants were locked away in Iranian prisons. Even more, numerous historical movements with applied eschatology motives have been, strictly speaking, secular in nature. To quote Daniel Chiro and Clark Macaulay at length, quote, "It was not an accident that Hitler promised a 1,000-year Reich, a millennium of perfection, similar to the 1,000-year reign of goodness promised in Revelation before the return of evil, the great battle between good and evil, and the final triumph of God over Satan. The entire imagery of his Nazi party and regime was deeply mystical, suffused with religious, often Christian, liturgical symbolism. And it appealed to a higher law, to a mission decreed by fate and entrusted to the prophet Hitler. Thus, the Second World War was driven, in part, by an apocalyptic vision borrowed from Christian eschatology and repurposed for the particular nationalist, racist aims of the Nazi party. Similarly, Karl Marx appears to have plagiarized aspects of Christianity's grand narrative in his quote-unquote teleological or goal-directed theory of societal evolution. As Chiro and Macaulay note, Marxist eschatology actually mimicked Christian doctrine. It goes without saying that Marxism has been one of the most influential ideologies of the past 2 centuries. This ideology of cosmic struggle has driven revolts and revolutions, as well as global conflicts, both hot and cold. At its core is an eschatological doctrine that many believers have interpreted as a practical guide for accelerating history's inexorable march toward the telos of pure communism, a post-historical stage that constitutes the final epoch of social evolution. Once again, applied eschatology is hidden in plain sight. Today, the most conspicuous manifestation of the clash of eschatologies is found in the current epicenter of global violence, the Middle East. Again, this was written about 10 years ago. Let's begin with the roots of this conflict. In the 19th century, the Zionist movement emerged in response to the growing specter of anti-Semitism in Europe. While this movement was largely secular, the prophetic idea of the Promised Land played an important role in rationalizing the occupation of Palestinian territories. As Saleh Abdel Jawad writes, the claim that Palestine was given to the Jewish people by God enabled, quote, Zionists to allege that the Palestinians were usurpers in the Promised Land, and therefore their expulsion and death was justified. From the Christian, and in particular dispensationalist perspective, some leading figures saw the immigration of Jews to Palestine in the late 19th century as evidence that biblical prophecy was coming true. The American evangelist William E. Blackstone, for example, interpreted this demographic shift as a clear, quote, sign of the times, and argued that, quote, the United States has a special role and mission in God's plans for humanity, that of a modern Cyrus, to help restore the Jews to Zion. Cyrus the Great, to whom Blackstone refers, founded the Achaemenid Empire, and after conquering the Babylonian Empire, freed the Jews from captivity, allowing them to resettle in Jerusalem. The importance of a Jewish state for Christian evangelical dispensationalists relates to the specific end times narrative of this scriptural interpretation, one that was more or less invented by John Nelson Darby, a friend of William Blackstone, in the early 1800s. The crucial point for dispensationalists is that everything about God's future plans for humanity depends on the creation and continuation of a Jewish state in Palestine. This is why many Christian Zionists support Israel with dogmatic intransigence and see its establishment 3 years after Hitler put a pistol to his head as the most significant eschatological event since the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD, thereby supposedly fulfilling the prophecy of Mark 13, 1-2. The eschatological fact, according to dispensationalists, is that the tribulation cannot commence unless there's a Jewish state in Palestinian territories, and eternal peace will forever elude God's children until the tribulation occurs. The sociologist and pastor Tony Campolo summarizes this link between religion and politics as follows. Without understanding dispensationalism, it is almost impossible to understand how Christian Zionism has come to dominate American evangelicalism and been so influential on the course of U.S. Middle East policy. End of the excerpt. The crucial point for our purposes is that competing eschatological convictions have played an integral role in many events of world historical importance. The founding of Christianity, the rise of Islam, the Crusades, the Second World War, Marxist revolutions, contemporary U.S. support of Israel, as well as terrorist attacks perpetrated by groups like Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and El Shinrikyo. The clash of eschatologies is historically omnipresent. Here's yet another example, the current race to build AGI, or artificial general intelligence. This is also motivated by eschatological visions of utopia and the apocalypse, that is, a secular apocalyptic scenario that believers call an existential catastrophe. I've argued with computer scientist Dr. Timnit Gebru that the AGI race directly emerged out of the test grill ideologies, at the heart of which is a utopian belief that if we build a quote-unquote value-aligned superintelligence, we can task it with things like radically re-engineering humanity, creating a new post-human species, spreading beyond Earth, colonizing our future light cone, that is the region of the universe that is theoretically accessible to us, and building literally planet-sized computers on which to run trillions and trillions of happy, supposedly happy, digital people. On the flip side, this is the apocalyptic part, if superintelligence is value misaligned, Musk would even call this a demon, he's used that term before, then it will obliterate humanity and, along with us, this quote-unquote vast and glorious future that we could have otherwise created, to quote the quasi-religious words of Toby Ord. In fact, the backbone of the test grill bundle is transhumanism, which was explicitly developed in the 20th century as a secular replacement for traditional religion. This is why Julian Huxley, a very influential biologist and eugenicist of the 20th century, titled his 1927 book on transhumanist themes, Religion Without Revelation. Once you start snooping around the world and world history for examples of eschatology in action, you find them literally everywhere you look. Eschatology, in many ways, is what makes the world go round. 3. The extraordinary power of eschatology as a political tool. If you can convince people that the end is nigh, that one is fighting the Antichrist, and that Armageddon, an ultimate battle between good and evil, is at hand, you can persuade them to do just about anything. After all, what hangs in the balance is eternal life, perfect happiness, perpetual peace, and cosmic justice. With the stakes that high, what exactly is off the table? What act is morally impermissible? Indeed, eschatological thinking reinforces what my friend Francis Flannery, a noted biblical scholar, calls cosmic dualism, a powerful us versus them mentality. You're either on the side of good or you're against it. And is there anything more evil than someone who opposes capital G good, who impedes the realization of utopia, who rejects perfection? The degenerate others, capital O others, are the embodiment of all that is wicked in this world, and hence ought to be eliminated with neither mercy nor compunction. My guess is that Peter Thiel understands this dynamic, at least to some extent, and that's partly why he keeps talking about the Antichrist. There's an extraordinary coercive power to eschatological thinking, especially when weaponized as a political tool to influence and manipulate the faithful. As far as I can tell, the particular interpretation of biblical prophecy that Thiel is peddling goes something like this. We face two foes, the Antichrist and Armageddon. The former is a world government with, I kid you not, high taxes. An idea that is, quote, curiously consistent with other apocalypticists who've claimed that the Antichrist will gain power through supranational organizations like the European Union or United Nations. Thiel sees Greta Thunberg as an agent of the Antichrist. Pause here for a chuckle. Precisely because she advocates for global regulations targeting carbon emissions. If implemented, this would take us one more misstep down the slippery slope of regulatory regimes that interfere with other areas of industry, some of which Thiel has a vested interest in. Here's the strategy of antichristic agents, if you will. According to Thiel, they use the threat of Armageddon, a global-scale catastrophe or an existential disaster, as a pretext for establishing a world government. If you want to avoid annihilation or collapse, they say, we must sacrifice the quote-unquote freedom of corporations to continue polluting, exploiting, extracting, and doing whatever they see necessary to maximize their profits. Thiel responds that aligning with the Antichrist to avoid Armageddon is no solution at all. Rather, our eschatological task in these perilous times is to walk the narrow path between Armageddon and the Antichrist, to avoid an actual catastrophe while resisting the urge to accomplish this through global governance. This is a highly idiosyncratic, really quite bizarre reading of Christian eschatological themes. Many traditional believers will likely reject it. Nonetheless, by tapping into a rich reservoir of powerful images embedded within our collective imagination, images that have played a crucial role in some of the most consequential events of human history, Thiel may hope to mobilize people to join his pro-libertarian fight against the unholy forces of quote-unquote big government. If he convinces such people to switch from a, as it were, normal mode of mentation to a totalizing quote-unquote apocalyptic mindset, then suddenly the fight becomes far more urgent and important. It takes on an apocalyptic dimension, framed within the otherizing outlook of cosmic dualism, us versus them, good versus evil. If Greta Thunberg is just an annoying climate activist, she can be safely ignored. But if she's an agent of the Antichrist, then she must be stopped immediately and at all costs. If those advocating for AI regulation are engaged in the work of the devil, then they too must be dealt with in a manner proportionate to the awesome stakes of the fight. This is an apocalyptic showdown to protect, preserve, and bring about paradise, which Thiel imagines happening through the unregulated development of advanced technologies. 4. The US is an apocalyptic nation. As Francis Flannery writes, the US is an apocalyptic nation. My Clash of Eschatology's thesis would further claim that much of the world has been and still is enthralled by apocalyptic expectations. I think that's true. She adds that, quote, the book of Revelation has arguably been responsible for more genocide and killing in history than any other. And that, quote, it is arguably the bloodiest book in history, because of the atrocities it's inspired. This is just to say, once again, that eschatological thinking is immensely intoxicating, seductive, and extremely powerful. With respect to the US being apocalyptic, consider that one poll from 2010 found that 41% of US Christians expect Jesus to return before 2050. Another reports that roughly 25% of Americans believed that Obama was the Antichrist during his presidency. A more recent Pew survey finds that, quote, in the United States, 39% of adults say they believe we're living in the end times, including 63% of evangelicals and 27% of Catholics. Hence, there's a very sizable demographic of people primed to believe the sorts of apocalyptic proclamations that Thiel is now spouting. As I've argued elsewhere, eschatological narratives are simultaneously rigid and elastic. There are fixed events that must occur, and the outcome is, of course, predetermined, but the exact nature of these events, the individuals involved, the particular ways in which they unfold, etc., are left open to interpretation. Eschatological narratives are like a fluid that can fill whatever container they're poured into, by which I mean they can accommodate a wide range of surprising political, geopolitical, cultural, technological, and so on developments. Things that might have once seemed to challenge or undermine eschatological narratives are often reinterpreted after or during the fact as actually reinforcing those very same narratives. Consider that in the midst of the Cold War, many Christian evangelicals quickly integrated the development of thermonuclear weapons into their prior eschatological worldviews. As Ronald Reagan said during a 1971 dinner when he was governor of California, quote, "For the first time ever, everything is falling in place for the Battle of Armageddon and the second coming of Christ. It can't be long now." Ezekiel 38:22 says that fire and brimstone will be rained upon the enemies of God's people. That must mean that they'll be destroyed by nuclear weapons. They exist now, and they never did in the past. The elasticity of otherwise rigid narratives thus offers an opportunity for charlatans like Peter Thiel to fill in the blanks by mapping those narratives onto contemporary events and arguing that such events are exactly what ancient prophecy was talking about all along, though we perhaps couldn't have seen that until now. There is, I doubt many people would object to this, no upper limit to the amount of power and wealth that sociopaths like Thiel want to acquire. And I say sociopath here because somewhat famously Elon Musk referred to Peter Thiel, his old friend, as a sociopath. Thiel responded by saying that Elon Musk is a fraud. Anyways, getting back to the article. Although Thiel is, philosophically, a rather simplistic thinker, my guess is that he has an intuitive understanding of, once again, the immense power of eschatology as a political tool. Without having seen his lecture series, I may modify my credence levels if a recording is leaked, and therefore I get more information. This is the main reason I suspect he's talking about the Antichrist and Armageddon right now, and insisting that people like Thunberg are agents of the Antichrist. So, to summarize the argument presented above, 1. Eschatological thinking is intoxicating and seductive because it offers a powerful source of comfort and hope in this weary world of gratuitous hardships and infuriating injustices. 2. Eschatological narratives can inspire people to act like no other ideologies or worldviews can, and quote-unquote justify, in the eyes of true believers, virtually any measure, no matter how extreme, to preserve paradise. 3. Charismatic or otherwise influential figures, like Thiel, can wield such narratives for political ends by convincing people that the enemy is evil, with a capital E, and the threat is apocalyptic. If this battle is lost, then all is lost forever. In other words, the stakes could not be higher. And 4, charlatans like Peter Thiel probably understand the extraordinary political power of a weaponized eschatological beliefs, and that's why he's talking about Armageddon and the Antichrist. 5. Peter Thiel is really weird. A second reason he might be obsessing over the Antichrist is that, well, the guy's just really weird. Perhaps he genuinely believes in his conception of the Antichrist and sees his lecture as an actual contribution to the relevant branch of theology. Maybe this is why he chose to give these talks in secret, or maybe he's just testing out the waters before making more public statements. Perhaps he imagines himself as a prophet who's offering the correct interpretation of Scripture. Many billionaires in Silicon Valley, after all, do see themselves as messianic figures, and Thiel is no exception to the rule, obviously. The irony, of course, is that Peter Thiel is a much better candidate for the Antichrist, or an agent thereof, than Thunberg. As Roth Douthat of the New York Times said to Thiel during a recent interview, quote, "And my very specific question to you, you're an investor in AI. You're deeply invested in Palantir, in military technology and technologies of surveillance and technologies of warfare and so on. And it just seems to me that when you tell me a story about the Antichrist coming to power and using the fear of technological change to impose order on the world, I feel like that Antichrist would maybe be using the tools that you are building. Like, wouldn't the Antichrist be like, great, we're not going to have any more technological progress, but I really like what Palantir has done so far. Isn't that a concern? Wouldn't that be the irony of history, that the man publicly worrying about the Antichrist accidentally hastens his or her arrival?" Thiel responds, "Look, there are all these different scenarios. I obviously don't think that's what I'm doing." Lols. So, those are my initial thoughts on the matter. What do you think? What am I missing? Please leave your comments in the comments section. I do read everything that people write. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the other side.